for this to get it absolutely right, and it's now very reliable. So I would recommend having a look at that if you're wanting to do scope things. The other thing people forget about is tie. Okay, tie is, people go, oh, it's dirty, it's evil. Well, maybe, but sometimes it's really useful because it lets you affect how a variable is invoked and keep track of it. It lets you make things do odd things. So, for example, if you have a routine that takes an array, and you want it to deal with that array lazily because the array is actually from a database query, if you use a tied array, you can have the tied array fetch records from the database only as you loop through it, and save yourself loading nearly as much data as you might otherwise have had to do. The fascinating thing is, tie will work on scalars, arrays, and hashes, but you can also tie file handles, which lets you make things that look like a file handle, but do something completely different. So, for example, if you're trying to test your logging code, if you pass a tied file handle in for the file handle to log to, your write method on your tied handle is called, instead of it actually printing anything out. And then you can collect that data and test it later. Which allows all sorts of interesting things. And if you've got code that's designed to read from a file, you can hand it a tied handle that causes it to read from a string or whatever. This is how things like IOScalar and IOString work. So, there's some interesting ideas. Now for something completely different. The only reason I'm marked as Moose Core Team is not because I'm a serious contributor. It's because when it was first released, I started using it heavily and broke it again and again and again, and helped find lots and lots of bugs that now all of the people using Moose in production will never see. For which Stephen was unaccountably grateful, even though I did drive him insane keeping breaking his code. So, destruction testing technology. Bend it as far as you can and see if it snaps. And funnily enough, I've been doing that since March 1983. Which also, funnily enough, is when I was born. I destroyed my first piece of technology at 3 days old. Because the thing is, I got bored, apparently. So I was born 2 weeks early. So they had to put me in an incubator in order to keep the tiny annoying thing that grew up into the big annoying thing before you today warm enough. So an incubator, it's basically a big glass fish tank, yeah? With a plastic tray for the small annoying thing to sit on, and a heater underneath. There's a design flaw in that, because there is a small gap between the plastic tray and the glass tank, which is all fine right up until the 2-day-old baby in the incubator manages to pee at just the right angle. And it goes down the side of the glass and reaches the electric motor. So, in the spirit of this, I thought I'd take some of these tricks and see how far we can bend them without them breaking. Now, I discovered an interesting fact while I was messing around with prototypes, which is that if you have an invalid prototype, something that contains something that makes no sense to Perl, all you actually get at pass time is a warning. It doesn't become an error until you try and call that subroutine. So if you don't call it as a bare subroutine in your code, you never get an error. And I'd been thinking for a while that I kind of liked the devil declare type syntax, but I wanted to be able to do it without having to build a load of C code. And I realised that because it's only a warning, I can put whatever I like in the prototype. So I thought, why don't I build a web dispatcher using this? So you have a dispatch sub that takes subroutines with prototypes And the prototypes specify what HTTP methods and URLs they take. And then inside some code, I go through those subroutines, and I pull the prototype out, and then I pass it to a parser. And we already know how to build parsers. We use regexes with /gc, yeah? So, what you can do is you loop around, parsing a section at a time, blow up if you can't find a section, skip the separator, and because pos gives you the position in the string, you can use a test of pos against the length of the string, and because this is $_, you don't need to pass the arguments, and that lets you find out when you've got to the end of the string and finished your parse. So, and blam was, well, I kept getting annoyed because I kept getting the syntax wrong. So, we write a little routine called blam, which takes the position we're currently at, makes that many spaces, and a hat character. And that means you can produce nice errors that actually point out where the error was in your string while you were parsing it, in order to make it easier to get it right. So then I was thinking, okay, well, we're doing a URL and it's got a section that's variable. So because it's variable, we're going to want to pass it as an argument. And that's great, but I've been using moosex_declare too long. Fetching $self just annoys me now. I'm too used to not having to, because I just use a method keyword. So I thought, well, what can I do about that? I know. Let's create a $self global. So you do that by doing that, which creates basically a self-reference to $self. In fact, that idiom is exactly what useVars does, which is, of course, what we were all using before our was around. See? An antique, but still very useful. And then, you can write a routine that turns off strict references and sets a local $self to the current object. And then, if $run is a code ref, Perl, you see, when you call a method, it's not just a method name it can take. And I'm sure most of us have passed a scalar with a method name in. But it turns out, you can pass a subroutine reference as well. And Perl invokes that as a method call. So my sub that I passed in earlier, if that's in $run, when I call it like that, I get the right $self, it's invoked as a method, and the arguments are passed through. So that seemed quite nice, and then I was thinking, how do we do HTML output? Because everybody knows that generating HTML just sucks. So I thought, well, I could use templates. There's plenty of simple templating systems. But HTML isn't text, which is why generating it with Template Toolkit, while often the least worst choice, is still annoying. So I thought, well, I really kind of wish I could just put it straight in the Perl and generate it like that. And then I thought, actually, I can do that. Because, well, what's that?
It's, oh God.
It's a file handle call. Yes? On the file handle in the glob div. Now, didn't we say we could do something with file handles? Well, you can tie them. So what you do is you tie the div glob to a special class that's a tied handle class that and then what you do is you write a tie handle and a readline method. And when somebody does arrow div arrow, it invokes the readline method, which returns the value you passed in, and the value we passed in is arrow div arrow. So it returns the right HTML text. And then I went, well, that's great, but how do I handle that one? Because that's not a file handle call. Well, what it is it's actually a call to the glob built-in. Now, the nice thing about Perl built-ins is they have a namespace too, which is called core::global. So you can replace them. So you set core::global::glob to a subroutine that captures the string and returns the empty tag. And then, so you don't affect the rest of the program, you use the trick I showed, so that at the end of the scope, you delete your glob override back out of core global. So the rest of the program sees the real Perl glob if it uses it, and you don't break anything. So now, you can use XML tags, div, and that's a file handle call, that's a glob call. Both of them return the HTML you wanted, but as soon as we get to there, %h goes back, the destructor runs, and I can remove my magic file handle, and I can remove my magic glob function. So code outside of that never gets affected. But then I thought, that's okay, but what about interpolation? Because you're going to want to pass in attributes, yes? So we're trying to pass in attributes, and we go, okay, well, you know, we've got $stuff, we put it into an href, but it's got a quote in it. That's gonna completely wreck the HTML, yeah? So how do we deal with that? Well, it's a call to the glob routine with a string. We already know how to change strings, don't we? So what you do is, you see that Perl compiles it to that. So once you've got overload constant in scope, you can actually create objects out of those strings that have a stringify method that puts it back to the string so nothing else notices. And now you've got two objects. Now you've got objects, you can overload concatenation. At which point, you detect if what's been passed is another object like you, in which case it's a plain string, and pass it through. If it isn't, it must be a variable, and you can escape it. So, having done that, I thought, well, we need to hook this together. And really, you want to be able to make your HTML output just something that sits on the front of the rest of the application. So you could also have, say, an RSS output or a CSV output. So I implemented this syntax. So you have sub.html, which says strip the .html off the end, but this isn't a dispatcher for the entire request. It needs to filter the response. So we're now using a subroutine with an at prototype, as mentioned before, and that's got a method call in it. But how do you tell the difference between that and any other return? Well, there's no reason you can't just bless the code ref. So you bless the code ref into that special class that indicates this is a filter, and then if you detect it's a response filter, instead of treating that as the end of dispatch, you call dispatch again with the remaining matches. So you have your .html match at the top, that then reruns dispatch with all of the rest of the matches going down, and then applies the HTML filter on the way out. So, having done all this, what's the end result? Well, go to at demo. I suppose I have to show you some code now. So, we have the fascinating bloggery module, because obviously if you're going to do a web app example, it has to be a blog. So, we have a quick object that's doing a list of posts, uses file stat. That's another wonderful module because it means that the stat built-in now returns an object, and you can call methods on it, instead of having to remember the numbers for all of the things you want. So, we look in the directory, and we can use glob safely here. That's going to be the normal Perl glob, because we already made sure XML tags was safe and didn't touch the rest of the program. Make sure that's not a summary, sort it for newest, and then produce post objects. Another quick routine to get post objects, and map so that you can call arrow map with a subroutine on your post list, rather than doing a straight functional map. And your post object is simple as well. Load it from a file, just bless up an object. You can get the title just by pulling from the file name, and the data comes from local@argv$. So I don't have to worry about auto-die or die, and I know I'll get an error if the file's not there. And then we go into the actual application, package bloggery.